Hello everyone, welcome to Physics Wallah English YouTube channel. I'm Shalini Somashekar, your botany teacher, and in today's session, I'm going to be continuing with the chapter Morphology of Flowering Plants. In the previous session, we started with this chapter and that was lecture 1. If you went back and studied about it and if you recollect what you learned in the previous session, you will know that we covered the different vegetative parts of the plant. We learned about the root, stem, leaf, morphology as well as modifications. So in today's session, which is lecture 2 of the same chapter, we are going to be covering inflorescence, which is basically a group of flowers, different parts of a flower. We will learn individually about calyx, corolla, androecium, gynoecium and the different variations in it. After that, we will move on to the different types of fruits that we see in plants and also about seeds. Okay, so these are the things that we will be covering in today's session. So let's begin today's session by starting with inflorescence. Inflorescence is nothing but a group of flowers. Okay, so if you look at the NCERT textbook definition, inflorescence is defined as the arrangement of flowers on the floral axis. So inflorescence is basically how the flowers are arranged on the floral axis. Now what exactly is a floral axis? Whichever part or branch of the plant that bears the flowers is called the floral axis. So the arrangement of these flowers on the floral axis that I've highlighted here is what we call inflorescence. Okay. Now let's first understand about what exactly a flower is and how is it formed. Okay. So flower is nothing but a modified shoot. We say that flower is a modified shoot. We've already learnt about the stem and its characteristic features, right? So I'll tell you how exactly a shoot or a stem gets modified to become a flower. All right. So let's take a stem for example. As you know, stems, the characteristic feature, one of the characteristic features of stems is that it has nodes and internodes, right? So let me draw a couple of nodes over here. At the nodes, we know that leaves will arise, right? So on this stem, I will draw a few leaves. From each node, I'm drawing 2 leaves arising. Okay. So what happens in flowers is, the leaves that are present here, these leaves will modify into floral parts. So what happens is, the lowermost leaves present in the lowermost node that I've drawn here, these will become reduced, smaller and form the calyx of the flower. Okay. Now, the leaves that are present in the node above it will modify to form bright, colorful petals. The node above that, instead of leaves being formed, when a flower is being formed, the stamen will form. And finally, at the last node, the pistil or gynoecium will form. So in a normal shoot, you have nodes and internodes. From the nodes, the leaves will arise. But when a flower is being formed, instead of the leaves, you will see other floral parts like sepals, petals, stamens and pistil. Okay. So this is what we mean when we say flower is a modified shoot. Over here, one thing we must understand is that whenever a flower is forming, the internodes do not elongate. You do not see such long internodes because the axis gets condensed. Because the internodes are not very long and the axis gets condensed or, compressed, you will see that the flower will look like this. So what will happen in the flower is, it will appear like all of these different parts, sepals, petals, stamen and pistil, it will seem like they're all coming from the same point. But in reality, what has happened is they are present in different nodes, and the internodes are too small, too short, they are condensed, that you can't really make out where is the node, where is the internode. But this is how a shoot gets modified when it forms a flower. Over here, the internodes do not elongate and the axis gets condensed. So different kinds of floral appendages. Over here, when we say floral appendages, we're talking about calyx, corolla, and rhizome, gynoecium. These appendages are produced at the nodes. Like I already said, instead of leaves being produced at the nodes, these different appendages will be produced in the shoot. So that is how the flowers will form. All right. Now, let's move on to learn about the different types of inflorescence. Talking about the broad category, flowers can be formed singly or they can be formed in groups, right? If a flower is formed singly in a plant, we call it solitary. Okay, so such flowers are said to be solitary flowers. And if there is more than one flower that is grouped together, we call it, that can be of two types. Either the flower is single or more than one flower is present in group. If it is a single flower, then we say it is solitary. If there is more than one flower, these flowers in the group can be arranged in two ways. The first way is racemose type of inflorescence. The second type is called cymose type of inflorescence. I repeat, flowers can be produced singly or in clusters and groups. If it's a single flower, we say it's solitary. If there's more than one flower, then it can be arranged in one of two ways. One type of arrangement is called racemose type of inflorescence. The second type of arrangement is called cymose type of inflorescence. All right. Now, let's talk about each of those different types, starting with the single flower. What happens here is, it is formed by the direct transformation of the shoot tips. We've already spoken about the different parts of the shoot, right? So you know that in the shoot tips, there is meristematic tissue. The tip of the shoot itself, if it transforms into a flower, then usually it will be a single flower, or we call it solitary. Okay. Now let's move on to learn about the other types of inflorescence where there is more than one flower arranged together. All right. Let's start with racemose inflorescence. In racemose inflorescence, what happens is, Gulmohar or P family, Fabaceae family, this is a very good example for showing racemose type of inflorescence. In racemose type of inflorescence, look at the floral axis. This is the floral axis. This is the axis on which the flowers are born. If you look at the floral axis, at the tip of the floral axis, you do not see any flowers, right? So, since there are no flowers here, the shoot apical meristem is intact. Since there is meristematic tissue here at the tip, because it is not ending with a flower, we say that this type of floral meristem, floral axis can grow indefinitely. In this type of axis, growth is indefinite because the floral axis is not terminating with a flower. If you look at the arrangement of flowers, you can see all of these circles here are representation of flowers. You can see that the flowers are borne laterally. Lateral means sides. Okay. You can see from the floral axis, the flowers are arising from the sides. That is called lateral. Lateral anywhere in biology means from the sides. Okay. So flowers are borne laterally in acropetal succession. This is an important term for you to understand. Acropetal means this type of arrangement is similar to the arrangement of leaves that you see. Okay, over here, the older flowers will be arranged towards the base, whereas the young flowers are arranged at the tip. Even in leaves, if you notice, if this is the stem, older leaves will be at the base. As you go up, you will have younger leaves, right? Such a similar arrangement of flowers you can observe in racemose type of inflorescence. I repeat, you must remember three things here. Firstly, the floral axis does not terminate with a flower. At the tip of the floral axis, you do not find any flower, as a result of which the apical meristem, the shoot apical meristem, is intact. Because you have meristematic tissue at the tip, it will continue to grow. So we say that the growth of the floral axis here is indefinite or indeterminate. Second point is flowers are borne laterally. You have the floral axis, flowers are borne on the sides of it, so we say that flowers are borne laterally. The third point is based on how are the flowers arranged on the floral axis. The youngest are at the tip, the older ones are at the base. Such a type of arrangement is referred to as acropetal arrangement or acropetal succession. You can see that in leaves as well. Alright, now let's move on to the second type of inflorescence, which is the opposite of what we learnt in racemose inflorescence. So over here we call this cymose type of inflorescence. Over here, the floral axis terminates with a flower. Because the floral axis has terminated with a flower, the shoot apical meristem has transformed in forming this flower. So over here the shoot apical meristem is not there because it has transformed into the flower. This floral axis cannot grow any further. As a result, we say that the growth of the main axis in case of cymose inflorescence is definite or determinate. That means it cannot grow beyond this, right? Now, over here, the main axis terminates into a flower, and therefore, like I mentioned, this shows limited growth. Over here, as opposed to what we learnt in racemose inflorescence, over here, the arrangement of flowers on the axis is the opposite. The oldest flowers are at the tip, while the relatively younger ones are at the base. So what happens in this is, you have the floral axis, the first flower itself is formed at the tip. After that, the floral axis will produce branches. These branches will further produce flowers. See, this is the first flower. Let me use a different color so it's clear. So, yeah. So this is the first flower that is formed in this inflorescence. Following this, these two branches are produced. These are the second set of flowers that are produced. Again, here, this meristems are lost because the shoot apical meristem transforms into the flower. Since any more growth cannot happen on this axis, this will produce branches like this again, and here you will have the third set of flowers. So as you can see clearly, at the tip you have the oldest flower or the first formed flower, and towards the base you will have the relatively younger flowers. Such a type of succession or arrangement is called basipetal arrangement. Acropetal is in leaves and in racemose inflorescence. Basipetal we see in cymose inflorescence. I hope that is clear. Jasmine is a very good example. I'm sure all of you must have seen jasmine in real life. So the next time you see jasmine, don't just adore it for its beauty. Look at how the flowers are arranged. All right. So that's about cymose inflorescence. Now let's move on to the different parts of the flower. As you already know, flowers have 4 major whorls. Let's start by talking about the stalk of the flower. The stalk of the flower is called the thalamus, right? And at the tip of the thalamus, you have a broadened base that you can see. I'm sorry. The stalk is called the pedicel. This broad base that you see at the tip of the pedicel is what we call the thalamus. On top of the thalamus, you can see floral parts like petals, sepals, androecium and all of that arranged in concentric circles, which we call whorls. Okay. So the outermost whorl over here is composed of petals, which is sepals, which is collectively called calyx. Following that, we have corolla, which comprises of petals. Inside that, we have androecium, which has stamens. And innermost wall, you have the gynoecium or pistil, and its individual units are called carpels. So these are the different parts of a flower. Over here, we know that flower is the sexual reproductive organ in angiosperms, right? Angiosperms' characteristic feature is the production of flowers. No other group of plants will produce flowers. But why do angiosperms produce flowers? Because it is within the flowers that the gametes are produced, right? When you consider humans also, whichever part of the body will produce the gametes, we call that the reproductive organ. Similarly, in flowering plants, it is the flower that will produce the male and female gametes. Therefore, we refer to it as sexual reproductive organ of a plant. Now, when you look at the different parts, androecium is the part that will produce the male gametes, so it is called the male reproductive part. Similarly, gynoecium is the part that will produce the female gametes, so that is the female reproductive part. Since the function of flower is to help in sexual reproduction, androecium and gynoecium, they are absolutely essential for the process of reproduction, because reproduction is all about formation and fusion of gametes. These are the organs that are responsible for formation of gametes. So they are essential for sexual reproduction. Whereas when you consider corolla and calyx, sepals and petals, of course, if they are there in the flower, it is useful. But even if they are not there, the flower can still perform sexual reproduction. All right. So in this chapter, in flowers, we call corolla and calyx as accessory whorls. And we call androecium and gynoecium as essential whorls. All right. Going forward in this lecture, we are going to be learning individually about sepals, petals, androecium, gynoecium. Okay. Now, in some flowers, the calyx and corolla is not distinguished properly. There is no separate calyx and corolla. Instead, they will just have one whorl, which is non-essential or an accessory whorl. That is referred to as perianth. This can be observed in flowers like lily, which is a monocot plant. So in flowers of lily, the calyx and corolla are not clearly distinct. As you can see in this image here, you don't see calyx and corolla separately. There's just one whorl along with androecium and gynoecium, and that is referred to as perianth. Okay, and the units of this perianth, each individual member of this perianth, is called tepal. So a collection of tepals is what we call as perianth. All right. Now let's talk about the different types of flowers based on whether they have only one reproductive part or both of them. Okay, so this is very easy type of classifying flowers. The first type is bisexual and the second type is unisexual. As the name itself indicates, bi means two, right? If a flower has both male and female reproductive parts, that is androecium, which is the male reproductive part, and gynoecium, which is the female reproductive part. If they are both present in the same flower, then such flowers are said to be bisexual. All right. In contrast, we have flowers that either carry only the male reproductive part androecium or just the gynoecium. Such flowers are said to be unisexual. Remember, uni means one. Okay, so the term uni anywhere in biology or generally refers to one, bi means two. Bisexual has both male and female reproductive organs. Unisexual flowers will have either of them, either androecium or gynoecium. Okay, so if a flower has only androecium or only gynoecium, then it is referred to as unisexual flower. If it contains only androecium, we call such flowers staminate flowers. If the flower contains only the female reproductive part or the gynoecium, then can you guess what it could be called? Stamen, staminate. Gynoecium is also called pistil. So these flowers are called pistillate flowers. Is that clear? This classification of flowers is based on whether only one of the two reproductive parts are present or if they're both present. If they're both present, it's bisexual. If only one of them is present, it's unisexual. If in unisexual there's only androecium present, we call such flowers staminate flowers. If only gynoecium is present, we call such flowers pistillate flowers. All right. Now let's learn about the different types of flowers based on their symmetry. In the chapter called Animal Kingdom, you've already learnt about the different types of symmetry in animals, right, that we observe in animals. So here we are going to learn something similar, but with respect to flowers. All right. So the first type of flower based on its symmetry is called actinomorphic. Now these actinomorphic flowers are radially symmetrical, or they exhibit radial symmetry. Now what do I mean when I say they are radially symmetrical? You take a flower and cut the flower in any plane that passes through the center. It could be this plane. See, when you cut this flower through this plane that is passing through the center, you get two identical halves, right? They're like mirror images. You get two identical halves. If I cut this flower through this plane, I still get two identical halves. If I cut it through this plane, I will still get through two identical halves. So if a flower can be divided into two equal halves in any plane, radial plane that is passing through the center, then we refer to such flowers as radially symmetrical flowers. All right. So that's about the first type of flower based on symmetry. Now let's look at the some examples of actinomorphic flowers. Mustard flower, very popular in the movie DDLJ. You must have seen there's a song that Shah Rukh Khan plays or sings in the mustard field, right? So these are those flowers. This is actinomorphic, or it exhibits radial symmetry. Datura flowers, chili flower. Both of these are members of the family Solanaceae or brinjal family. They also exhibit radial symmetry. So these flowers are radially symmetrical. Okay. So we call them actinomorphic. Now let's move on to learn about the second type of flower based on symmetry, which is zygomorphic flowers. When we say flowers are zygomorphic, we mean to say that these flowers exhibit bilateral symmetry. Now what do we mean when we say bilateral symmetry? In these flowers, you can obtain two equal halves only when you cut it through one vertical plane. Only when you cut this flower through this plane can you get two identical halves. If I cut it like this, you won't get it. This part looks very different from this part, right? So if a flower can be divided into two equal halves by only one vertical plane that is passing through its center, then we refer to it as zygomorphic flower. Such flowers are said to exhibit bilateral symmetry. All right, let's look at some examples for this. You can see that in pea flower, gulmohar, bean flower and cassia. So Fabaceae members, they exhibit bilateral symmetry, and therefore their flowers are zygomorphic. Fabaceae is the family of plants that includes peas, beans. All right. So all of these are example for zygomorphic flowers. Then the third type of flower based on its symmetry is asymmetric flowers. These flowers are said to be irregular. They just don't follow any rules, and you cannot get two equal halves in any plane that you cut them in. Okay, so this flower cannot be divided into two similar halves in any vertical plane passing through the center. Okay, so such flowers are said to be asymmetric. Example for that is canna. Canna is a monocot plant. Its flowers are asymmetric. That means in any plane you cut it, you will not get two equal halves. Is that clear? Based on symmetry, we have three types of flowers: actinomorphic, zygomorphic, asymmetric. Actinomorphic, in any plane that passes through the center, you get two equal halves. Zygomorphic, only through one vertical plane passing through the center, you get two equal halves. Asymmetric, cut it through any plane that passes through the center, there's no way we can get two equal halves. So such flowers are said to be asymmetric. Okay, example I've already given for all the three. Now, based on the number of floral appendages that are present, we can classify flowers. Okay, so flowers can either be trimerous, tetramerous or pentamerous. Again, the name itself here indicates how this classification is made. Tri, the word tri means three. Tetra refers to four. Penta refers to five. If a flower has floral appendages that are in multiples of three, like the flower will either have three sepals, three petals, three stamens, three carpels, or multiples of three. Like we can see in lily, there are six tepals, right? So three or multiples of three, six sepals, six petals, six stamens. If they are in multiples of three, then we refer to such flowers as trimerous flowers. Tetramerous flowers, very similarly, if the floral appendages are present in multiples of four sepals, four petals, then we refer to such flowers as tetramerous flowers. Coming to pentamerous flowers, over here the floral appendages will be in multiples of five. Five sepals, five petals, 5 or 10 stamens. So if they are in multiples of 5, then we refer to such flowers as pentamerous flowers. Is that clear? Now let's move on to learn about the types of flowers based on the presence of bracts. Bracts are nothing but reduced leaves that are found at the base of the pedicel. I already told you what the pedicel is. Pedicel is the stalk of the flower. So if you have a flower, this is the stalk, which is the pedicel. At the base of the pedicel, if you have a leaf-like structure, reduced leaf-like structure, which is called the bract, such flowers are said to be bracteate. If bracts are absent in flowers, we refer to it as ebracteate. Students get confused between bracts and stipules. Bracts are usually present singly at the tip of the pedicel, which is the stalk of the flower. About stipules, we've already learnt in the previous lecture. Stipules are usually paired. They are also very thin, small leaf-like structures, but they are present at in the petiole, in the leaf. You don't find them in flowers. Okay, so near the leaf base is where you find the stipules. They are usually paired. In the stalk of the flower, the pedicel, at the base of that is where you find the bracts, and these are usually present singly. So that is the difference between stipules and bracts. All right. Now let's move on to the next type of classification of flowers. So flowers can also be classified based on the position of other whorls with respect to the ovary. Now what do we mean here? You know, in flowers, the outermost whorl is the calyx. Following that, within the calyx, you have petals. Within the petals, you have the androecium or the stamens. And within that, we have the ovary. Based on how calyx, corolla, androecium is arranged with respect to ovary, how is the position of the other three whorls with respect to the ovary. Based on that, we can classify flowers into 3 different types. Okay? So the 3 different types are hypogynous, perigynous, and epigynous. Hypogynous flowers, as the name itself indicates, hypo means the term hypo means below, gynous refers to gynoecium. Right? So hypogynous flowers, I'm telling you that this classification is based on the position of other whorls with respect to the ovary. So in hypogynous whorls, in hypogynous flowers, the other whorls, calyx, corolla, and rhizome, they are arising from below the ovary. That is why it is called hypogynous. Hypo means below, gynous relates to the gynoecium. So you can see that the other whorls are arising from below the gynoecium. Therefore, such flowers are said to be hypogynous. Now, over here in such flowers, as you can see, the ovary occupies the topmost position. Since gynoecium or the ovary occupies the highest position in the flower, here we say that the ovary is superior. Ovary is superior, flower is hypogynous. Hypogynous because other floral parts are arising from below the gynoecium. Why is the ovary superior? Because ovary is occupying the highest position. Superior means on top, right? Inferior means at the bottom. Here the ovary is superior, flower is hypogynous. And yeah, so the other whorls, like I already mentioned, arise from below the gynoecium. Such flowers are said to be hypogynous flowers. Some examples of hypogynous flowers include mustard flower, hibiscus flower, which is also called shoe flower, China rose, and brinjal. All of these are examples of flowers that are hypogynous. Next time you see a hibiscus flower, if you can find it, you can check how all of the other whorls are arising from the gynoecium. Once you peel off the sepals, take out the petals, remove the stamen thing, that is inside, that is where you will find the gynoecium, right? So all other whorls are arising from below the ovary. Okay, so that is about hypogynous flowers. Now let's talk about the second type of flower based on position of other whorls with respect to the ovary. This is perigynous. Over here, peri means around. Gynous again relates to gynoecium. So again, the name itself will indicate how the other whorls are arranged with respect to the gynoecium. Okay, so here you can see the thalamus kind of forms like a cup-like structure. At the center, you will find ovary. If you look at this ovary here, this is half inside the cup, half outside, half inside the thalamus, half outside the thalamus. This green color structure is what represents the thalamus. This ovary here is half present within the cup and half of it is present outside the cup. Over here, the gynoecium occupies the center. All other whorls seem to arrange from almost the same level at the rim of the thalamus. Okay, so I'll tell you what rim of thalamus is. If you consider like a cup, the top portion of the cup, that is called the rim. Over here, the thalamus is forming kind of like a cup-like structure. So the top portion of it is what we call the rim. All of these whorls, as you can see, the sepals, the petals, and rhizome, all of this is arising from the rim here. So the other whorls are pretty much at the same level. If you take the center of the ovary, all the other whorls are arising at the same level of the ovary, and at the rim of the thalamus. Over here, the ovary, if you consider, let me erase this part. If you consider what I'm highlighting right now in pink, if you consider this part of the ovary with respect to these whorls, if you consider this part, then you can say that this part is inferior with respect to these other whorls, right? Because it's present below this. This is the point where other whorls are arising. A part of the ovary is present below that. So that part we can say is inferior. And whatever I'm going to highlight right now in a different color, let's take red for a change. If you consider this part is superior. If you consider this level, then this part of the ovary is present above the level where the other whorls are arising. So half of this ovary is inferior, half of it is superior with respect to where the other whorls are arising from. Therefore, this type of ovary is called half inferior, or sometimes we also say that is half superior. In the previous type, we saw that the ovary was superior. Clearly, all of the other whorls were arising from the base of the ovary. Over here, if you look at the point where other whorls are arising, then one half of the ovary is below that, one half of the ovary is above that. So, such an ovary, we can say that it is half inferior or half superior, because all of the other whorls with respect to the center point of this ovary are arising at pretty much the same level. We can say that this is perigynous flower and the other whorls are arranging from the rim of the thalamus, because the thalamus is here kind of like a cup shape. Okay. Now let's move on to the third type. Before that, here are the examples for perigynous flowers. Perigynous P, you have two examples that begin with P. Plum flower, peach flower, and also rose flower. These are the three examples for perigynous flowers. Now, let's move on to the third type of flower based on the position of the ovary. It is epigynous flower. Epi over here means above. Epi anywhere means above. Gynous here again refers to gynoecium. Okay. So in epigynous flowers, other whorls arise from above the ovary, on top of the ovary. I'll tell you why this happens. That is because this ovary is completely fused and enclosed with the thalamus margin. So the thalamus has formed a cup-like thing. Within that you have the ovary. The inner wall of the thalamus has kind of completely fused with the ovary. So the ovary is fully embedded within this cup-like thalamus. Okay. So when you look at the other floral whorls here, they are arising from here. Here you have the calyx. Here you have corolla or petals. Here you have the androecium. So here is the ovary. Other whorls are arising from above the ovary. So we say that such flowers are epigynous. Gynous because gynoecium or ovary part. Epi because they are arising from above. In this case, you can see that the ovary occupies the lowest position. Okay. I don't think it's written here. Since it occupies the lowest position in the flower, we refer to it as inferior ovary. Remember, when we're saying inferior, half inferior or half superior and superior, we're talking about the ovary specifically. When we're talking about hypogynous, epigynous, perigynous, then we're talking about the flower. Okay? Let's look at the examples. Guava flower, cucumber flower, ray florets of sunflower. All of these are examples for epigynous flowers. If you don't know what ray floret is, actually sunflower is not a flower, it is an inflorescence. It is a type of inflorescence called head inflorescence. Over here, each floret that you see here, like this one, each one is a flower. Since it's a very tiny flower, we call it a floret. So these are called the ray florets of sunflower. In these ray florets, you can see that this is the ovary part, and from above that the other whorls are arising. So this is example for epigynous flower. Similarly, whatever is lining, whatever flowers are present, very tiny inconspicuous flowers are present in the center of sunflower, they are called disc florets. Okay, so this epigynous nature of flowers can be observed in these ray florets of sunflower. Okay, now let's quickly revise. Gynoecium occupies highest position in hypogynous. In perigynous, it is half inferior, half superior. In epigynous, gynoecium is the bottommost, or the ovary is the bottommost. In hypogynous, or other floral whorls will arise from below the level of the ovary. In perigynous, it will arise from pretty much the same level as the ovary, at the center of the ovary. And epigynous, it will arise from the top of the ovary. I hope this is clear. Okay, so we spoke about flower in general, the different ways of classifying flower based on the number of appendages that are present, based on whether one or two reproductive parts are present, based on symmetry, based on how the other whorls are arranged with respect to the ovary. These are different ways of classifying flower. Now, going forward, we will learn about individual parts of a flower and the different variations that we see in those parts. Okay, like I already mentioned in the beginning of this class, flower will usually have 4 important parts: calyx, corolla, androecium, and gynoecium. Calyx and corolla are called non-essential or accessory whorls because they are not absolutely important for the process of sexual reproduction, whereas androecium and gynoecium are referred to as essential whorls because they are required to produce gametes. Now, going forward, we are going to be learning about individually these parts of flower and their variations in the exact same order. First, we'll finish calyx, corolla, and then we'll talk about androecium and then gynoecium. All right. Let's begin with calyx. As I already said, the units of calyx, individual units, are called sepals, right? Now, in some flowers, sepals are free. They are not fused. While in some flowers, all of the sepals will fuse together. Depending upon whether the sepals are free or if they are fused, you can categorize calyx into 2 different types. One is polysepalous, the other one is gamosepalous. In polysepalous, you can see over here, each of them is separate. It's easy to pluck it out. You can pluck them out like individual leaves. But in some flowers, the sepals are fused. Like you can see here, it has fused to form a cup-like structure. Such sepals are said to be gamosepalous. Such a calyx is said to be gamosepalous. Clear? Poly, if it is free, individual units of calyx, if the sepals are free, then we call it polysepalous. If they are fused, then we call it gamosepalous. Okay? Similarly, we have corolla, units of corolla, individual units. It's called petals. Depending on whether they are free or fused, we have 2 different types. The first type is called polypetalous. As you can see here, it's free. They have not fused. Here, if you look, These are the demarcations, right? This is one petal, this is the other petal, but you can see that they fuse to form a bell or a cup-like structure. Okay, such petals are called, such a corolla is called gamopetallous. I repeat, polysepalous is for sepals when they are free. Gamosepalous is for sepals when they are fused. Polypetalous is the term that we use to describe the condition of free petals. Gamopetallous is the term that we use to describe the condition of fused petals. Okay? Now let's talk about aestivation. Aestivation is also about sepals and petals. Depending upon how the sepals or petals are arranged with respect to each other, we have different types of aestivation. So aestivation basically talks about arrangement of sepals or petals in the floral bud with respect to other members of the same whorl. So over here we are either considering calyx or corolla. If you're considering calyx, how are the sepals arranged with respect to each other? If you're considering corolla, how are the petals arranged with respect to each other? Is there any specific way in which they are arranged? Is there any pattern that you can see? Okay, so the arrangement of either sepals or petals in a floral bud with respect to each other within the same whorl is what we call aestivation. There are four major types of aestivation that we can see in flowers. That is valvate, twisted, imbricate, and vexillary. We learn about each of these one by one. Let's start with valvate aestivation. Very simple type of aestivation. Here the sepals or petals, they touch each other at the margin. Here you can see this is a flower. How exactly these petals are arranged in the flower is represented with this diagram here. So there are 5 petals, or it could be sepals even. They touch each other at the margin. This is the margin that we're talking about. Okay, so they're arranged just next to each other and they're touching each other at the margin, at the ends, at the tips. Okay, so this type of arrangement can be seen in Calotropis. Valvate aestivation can be seen in Calotropis. One thing you must understand here is that there is no overlapping. It's not like, if you see here, in this type, you can see that this petal or sepal is overlapping this one. That kind of overlapping we do not see in valvate. They're just present right next to each other and they just simply touch each other at the margins, but you do not see any kind of overlapping here. Alright, now let's move on to the second type, which is called twisted aestivation. This is a very cute type of aestivation to look at. Here again, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 petals or sepals used for representation. You can see how, if you consider this to be a petal, you can see that on one end it is overlapping the previous one. This one is overlapping this one here, and the next one is overlapping this one. So it is overlapping the previous one and being overlapped by the next one. If you look at this petal again, this one is overlapping the previous one. It is being overlapped by the next one. So that will happen for all the petals. One margin of the sepal or petal overlaps that of the next one and so on. Did you get my point? Here we do see some overlapping which was not there in valvate. So if this is one petal, the next one will overlap it here. On one end it is overlapping the previous one. In the other end it is being overlapped by the next one. So that is what we observed here. This kind of aestivation can be seen in case of China rose, which is also called hibiscus, lady's finger flower, and also cotton flower. This type of aestivation is called twisted aestivation. Okay, now let's move on to the next type. which is imbricate estivation. Over here, we do see some petals or sepals overlapping one another. But unlike what we saw in twisted estivation, where there was a specific pattern, right? Every time petal or sepal was overlapping one and being overlapped by the next. But over here, you don't see that overlapping in any particular direction. So as you can see here, there are 5 petals used for representation. One petal is fully inside. It is being overlapped by both its neighboring petals on both sides. If you look at this petal or sepal, it is fully outside. It is overlapping both its neighboring petals. And if you look at the other 3, it's half in, half out. Okay, so this petal is fully in. This petal or sepal is fully out. This one is in on this side, out on this side. This one is in on this side, out on this side. Similarly, it's out here, in here. Okay, so you have one petal that's fully in, one petal that's fully out, and the other 3 are half in, half out. So you don't really have a fixed pattern in which there is overlapping. Such type of estivation is called imbricate estivation. Over here, the margins of sepals or petals overlap. They do overlap one another, but it doesn't happen in any specific or particular direction. Such a type of estivation can be observed in cassia and gulmohar. Okay, in their sepals you can see such an estivation. Now let's move on to the next type, which is vexillary estivation, or it is also called papilionaceous estivation. This is very, very important because very frequently in exams questions are asked based on this. Also, this is how the estivation of petals is in Fabaceae family, about which you'll be learning in detail in the next lecture. Okay, so over here there are 5 petals. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The size of the petals are also variable. We do see overlapping here. The largest petal that you see here is present this largest petal is called standard or vexillum. So this is the largest petal of the 5. This large petal at both of its margins will overlap 2 relatively smaller petals that you see here. These are lateral in position. They are present at the sides. So these lateral petals are present. These lateral petals are overlapped by the standard or vexillum, which is the largest petal. These are called wings or alae. Now, what you must notice here is there is another 2 petals that are much smaller than the lateral petals. These lateral petals will overlap these petals that are called keel or carina, and these 2 petals are fused. Since the flowers petals that are arranged in the form of this estivation appear like butterflies, it is called papilionaceous. Papilionaceous relates to, it means butterfly-like. Since the petals in these flowers appear like butterflies, this type of estivation is called papilionaceous estivation. This is a characteristic feature of Fabaceae family. The reason why it's called vexillary estivation is because of this vexillum. Vexillum is the largest standard petal that we see here. That's why it's called vexillary. I repeat, there are 5 petals in total. one very large petal that's called the standard or vexillum. Inside that, this large vexillum will overlap two relatively smaller petals that are lateral in position. They are called wings or alae. These two lateral petals will further overlap two even smaller petals that are called keel or carina. And those two petals, the smallest petals in the flower, they are fused. Over here, we must remember which type of petal is present towards the posterior side and which is present towards the anterior side. This petal, the largest petal, is present posteriorly. The smallest is present anteriorly. I'll tell you what anterior and posterior here is. If this is the axis and from this axis the flower is borne here, the side of the flower closer to the axis is the posterior axis. The part of the flower or the side of the flower that is away from the axis is called the anterior part. So in this flower, the keel is present posteriorly, the standard is present posteriorly here, followed by that you have two lateral petals, followed by that you have two keel petal. This is how the arrangement will be. This is present posteriorly, smallest is present anteriorly. Is that clear? So this type of aestivation is called vexillary or papilionaceous aestivation. Examples, both of them are Fabaceae members, bean flower and pea flower. Alright, now let's move on. That was about calyx and corolla. Now we learn about what androecium is, what are its parts, and what are the different variations in androecium that we can see in flowers. Alright, so what is androecium basically? Androecium is a collective term that we use to describe a group of stamens. Many stamens together represents the androecium. All of the stamens in a flower collectively is called the androecium. Individual units of androecium is what we call stamens. So stamens, as you already know, are the male reproductive organs. Andro itself means male, right? So androecium is the male reproductive organ. Its units are called stamens. Each stamen will have two parts. This long, slender structure is called the filament. And this knob-like structure at the tip of the filament is what we call the anther. Okay? So generally in angiosperms, majority of the angiosperms, you will find that the anther has two lobes. One lobe, two lobe. Therefore, the anther is said to be bilobed. Okay? Now, each lobe will contain two pollen chambers. Okay, so if you take a section of this anther and you look inside, if these are the two lobes, inside each lobe you will find two sacs or two chambers that are called pollen sacs. Okay? Sometimes some flowers will have sterile stamens present in them. That means those stamens are reduced and they will not be able to produce the pollen grains. Such stamens are called sterile stamens. Sterile means inability to reproduce. Okay, so if a stamen is not capable of producing pollen grains, we call it sterile. In some flowers, we see the presence of sterile stamen. We refer to it as staminode. Some students get confused between staminode and staminate. Staminate we discussed at the beginning of today's class. Staminate is the flower that consists of only androecium. It is the term that we use to describe the flower that contains only androecium and is unisexual, whereas staminode is a flower where the androecium is not functional, It is incapable of reproducing or producing pollen grains. So sterile stamen is staminode. A unisexual flower bearing only stamens is staminate. Okay. Now, let's move on to learn about the different variations that we see in androecium. So, these previously we learnt about calyx and corolla, right? Sepals can be free or sepals can be fused. Petals can be free, petals can be fused. Similarly, androecium also can be fused within itself, like the stamens themselves can be fused, or sometimes these androecium elements or the stamen can be fused with other worlds like petals and tepals also. Okay, so based on cohesion and adhesion of stamens, we can categorize them. Sometimes stamens may be united with other members such as petals or tepals, and sometimes they are united among themselves. If they are united among themselves, we refer to it as cohesion. If it is other members, we call it adhesion. Okay, first learn about adhesion, fusion of stamen with other members. It can either be fused with the petals or it can be attached to the perianth, whose units are called tepals, like I already told you. If the stamen, as you can see in this illustration, it is completely fused with the petals, right? If you take it open, if you try to remove the stamens, a peel of the petals, a thin layer of the petals also will peel out. They are attached to each other. So, such a condition is said to be epipetalous. Again, I repeat, epi means above. Petalous obviously refers to petals. So, over here, the stamens is attached on top of or above the petals. Therefore, the condition is called epipetalous. Similarly, sometimes it can be attached to the perianth or tepals also. In this case, we do not use the term epitepalous. We say it is epiphyllous. Okay. So, in lily flower, you know, there is no segregation between calyx and corolla. All they have is one non-accessory whorl, which is called the perianth, and the units, individual units are called tepals. If the stamen is attached to the tepals, we call that condition as epiphyllous condition. All right. Now let's, I think I forgot to mention the example. In brinjal flower or in members of Solanaceae, brinjal family, potato family, you can see that to the petals, the stamen will be attached. Similarly, in lily flower, you can see that to the tepals, stamens are attached. Now, stamens attached to itself. Polyandrous is when stamens are free. They are not fused in any part. The filaments are free and there is also free. Adelphous is when the filaments are fused and the anthers are free. In stamens, we have two parts, right? Filament and the anther. In some flowers, the filaments are fused and the anther will be free. In some flowers, filaments and anthers would have fused. In some flowers, anthers will be fused, filaments will be free. But when we talk about fusion of stamens in your syllabus, all you have is fused filaments, free anthers. That condition is called Adelphi or Adelphous condition. Over here, I repeat, the filaments are fused but the anthers are free. There are three different types of Adelphi that we can observe. One is monoadelphous, two is diadelphous, third one is polyadelphous. As the name itself indicates, mono means one. If all of the filaments in the flower have fused to form one bundle, we call it monoadelphous. Example you can see in hibiscus. So next time you see a hibiscus, you have so many things to observe in it, right? So whatever you're seeing here, these are parts of filaments, but these filaments are really long. This tube that you see here, this is actually the fusion of all of these filaments. Only at the tips slightly they are free. Otherwise, they have fused to form one tube. Within that tube, you will find the style. Okay. So this is an example for monoadelphous condition where all of the filaments in the flower have fused to form one bundle. Next, we have diadelphous. Di means two. So over here, we can observe this in pea plants. There will be a total of 10 stamens. Of these 10 stamens, 9 of them have fused to form one bundle, and you have one separately. Even this one separate stamen also, we consider that as one bundle. So over here, this is one bundle. These 9 fused is considered as one bundle. Single one is considered as one bundle. Since there are 2 bundles, we say that this is diadelphous. Remember this carefully because this is also an example and characteristic feature of Fabaceae family. Okay. Now let's talk about polyadelphous. Very simple to guess. Poly means many. If there are more than 2 bundles present, then we refer to it as polyadelphous condition. As you can see here, there's one bundle, a second bundle. You can see a third bundle here. So at least 3 bundles you can see here. This can be observed in citrus plants where you have the filaments of stamens fused to form more than 2 bundles and the anthers are free. Okay. So that is called polyadelphous condition. I hope it is clear. Now let's talk about variations in stamen depending upon the length of the filaments. In many flowers, the length of the filaments of the stamen will be nearly equal. Okay. So all of the filaments in the androecium in a particular flower, they could be of the similar length. In some flowers, we see that there is a specific feature where a fixed number of stamens or filaments are shorter and a fixed number are relatively taller. Okay, we can observe that in salvia and in mustard plant. The stamen in salvia is called didynamis. Over here, there is a total of 4 stamens. There's a mistake here. There's a total of 4 stamens. Of these 4 stamens, you can see this one, this one. The first 2 stamens are long and these 2 stamens are relatively short. This you can see in all flowers belonging to salvia. They all have stamens in variable length. There are a total of 4 stamens. 2 of them are much longer compared to the other 2. That condition is called didynamis condition. Similarly, we have tetradynamis condition where the total number of stamens is 6. Over here, you have 4 long stamens. 1, 2, 3, 4. These are long. These 5th and 6th. These stamens are short. Such a condition can be observed in mustard flowers and this condition is called tetradynamis condition. Alright. Now that's all about androecium. Now we'll talk about gynoecium, which is the female reproductive part of the flower. So gynoecium is the female reproductive part. Its units are called carpels. It may be made up of 1 or more carpels. Ovary has 3 distinct parts. This bottommost swollen part is what we call the ovary. This long region is called the style. And the slightly expanded region is called the stigma. So you have 1, 2, 3 parts. Ovary, like I said, is the enlarged basal part. Style is the elongated tube. Stigma is slightly broad. This is where pollen grains are received. So this is the part that receives the pollen grains. Style acts as a connection between the ovary and the stigma. These are the different parts of gynoecium. Within the ovary, you will see the presence of ovules. Ovules are nothing but parts that will in future become the seeds. So within the ovary, ovules are present. Ovules number vary from one species to another. In some species, you can find only one ovule per ovary. In some species, like this illustration here, there is more than one ovule present in the ovary. So ovules are attached to a flattened cushion-like structure that is referred to as placenta. So these are the different parts of gynoecium. Depending upon how many carpels are present in the gynoecium, we can classify it into two types. Monocarpellary, as the name indicates, mono means one. So this will only have one carpel. This can be observed in wheat. Multicarpellary, multi means many. If there is more than one carpel, we refer to it as multicarpellary gynoecium. Now, depending upon whether the carpels are fused or whether they are free, you can further categorize multicarpellary condition into apocarpous, syncarpous. In apocarpous, you can see that the carpels, here 3 are represented. 1, 2, 3. They are free, they are not fused. This can be observed in lotus and rose. Such a condition is said to be apocarpous condition, where the carpels are more than one in number and they are free. If it's obviously only one, we don't talk about free or fused because there's only one, right? If there's more than one, it can either be free or it can be fused. If it is free, it is apocarpous. If it is fused, it is syncarpous. Example for syncarpous includes mustard and tomato. Okay? Now, let's talk about placentation. I just told you that placenta is this cushion-like structure that is present in the wall of the ovary, and to this placenta the ovule will attach, right? So depending upon how the ovules are arranged within the ovary, we have different types of placentation. There are 5 major types of placentation that we'll be learning about. That is marginal placentation, axial placentation, parietal placentation, precentral placentation, basal placentation. Okay, so these are the 5 different types of placentation. We'll go through it one by one. First, let's talk about marginal placentation. This looks very familiar, right? So this is actually a pea pod. You can see how the ovules are arranged here. Ovules are what will eventually form the seeds. Okay. So you all would have seen the pea pod and how the seeds are arranged within the pea pod, right? That itself is the placentation. It is basically arrangement of ovules within the ovary. Ovules form the seed. Ovary is the fruit. So if you can recollect how the seeds are arranged within these examples that I'm going to give, it'll make it very easy for you to understand. So in marginal placentation, the placenta forms a ridge along the ventral suture of the ovary. Now, you know that it's very easy to peel the pea pod and remove the seeds in one direction, right? What we usually do is we just pop it and then there's a small slit that forms. We open it like that. Now, suture means when there are two things and you're joining them, there is a stitch-like thing that forms, right? That is what we call as the suture. Over here, you know that in a pea pod, you have 2 different parts. They both are connected at two ends, right? The end at which they are ventrally collected, that is called the ventral suture. That is where the seeds or the ovules are attached. If you slit open a pea pod, you can see that the seeds are arranged like this. Okay, so this itself is the ventral suture. This ventral suture has an elevation. It is not flat. There is an elevation that is called the ridge. So inside here, the placenta will form an elevated structure which is called the ridge. At the ventral suture, wherever the two parts have joined ventrally, over there you can see a ridge. That is the placenta. And the ovules are borne on that elevation or ridge in two rows. Okay, so as you can see, this is one row of seeds or ovules. This is the other row. So they are borne on two rows. Example for that is pea plant. This type of aestivation is called placentation is called marginal placentation, because what is a margin? Is those edges, right? If you slit it open, you can see that the seeds are arranged at one edge only. Okay, so that's why it's called marginal placentation. Next, we have axile placentation. Example for this is lemon, China rose. I think you would have seen flowers more popularly. I'm not sure if you would have cut the ovary and seen how the ovules are arranged. Tomato and lemon, I'm sure you would have seen how the seeds are arranged within the fruit. Over here, one thing is, it is a multilocular ovary. This ovary has 1, 2, 3 locules. It is there are septa that are differentiating the 3 locules. There is a central axis. This axis is the placenta, and to this axis, ovules are attached. The placenta is axial. The placenta forms a central axis here. To the central axis, the seeds are arranged, right? This is exactly how the seeds are arranged in a lemon. If you cut open a lemon, you will see different partitions. Those partitions are nothing but these septa. And within each chamber there, within each locule, you can see some seeds arranged, right? Seeds attached. So that is how the ovules will be attached in the ovary. So here you have an axis. That is why it's called axial placentation. At the center of the ovary, the placenta will form an axis. The ovary is multi-chambered. It is multilocular. And to this axis, the ovules are arranged. That is why it is called axial placentation. Okay. Now let's move on to talk about parietal placentation. Over here, you do not see any axis. The placenta is present on the inner wall of the ovary. At the periphery. Periphery andre? Periphery means on the outer side. So the placenta is present on the inner wall of the ovary. To this placenta, the ovules are attached. Over here, the ovary is initially one-chambered. It will have only one chamber here, but eventually it will appear two-chambered because a false septum forms. A false septum forms, and the false septum is called rhepilum. I repeat, over here in parietal placentation, placenta is present at the periphery on the inner wall of the ovary. To that placenta, the ovules are attached. Initially, it is single chambered, one chambered. Eventually, it will appear two chambered because of the formation of a false septum, which we call the rhepilum. This kind of placentation can be observed in mustard and argemone. Okay? Argemone is another example which you cannot see here, but when you download the notes, definitely you will be able to see that example. Now let's move on to the next, which is free central. If you look at free central and axile, look at axile, look at free central, both of them appear pretty similar. The only difference here is there are no septa. So this is unilocular. In axile, lemon, we saw septa was present, ovules are arranged in the center. Over here, septa are absent, ovules are borne on a central axis, but there are no septa. So that is why it is called free central. Okay, this can be seen in dianthus and primrose. These are the examples for free central placentation. Next we have basal placentation. So far whatever you saw the transverse section of those ovaries. So if the plant is like this, and let's say this is the ovary, up until here we took a section of the ovary transversely and we are looking at it from above, so it looks like this. Now the next illustration that I'm showing you is actually taking a section of ovary like this, longitudinally. Okay, so here you can see that there is the ovary, ovule is attached to the base of the ovary. If the placenta develops at the base of the ovary and a single ovule is attached at the base, we refer to it as basal placentation. Such a type of placentation can be observed in sunflower and marigold. Okay, so that's about placentation. Now let's move on to fruits. What is fruit basically? Fruit is also a characteristic feature of angiosperms like flower. The flower after fertilization. In a flower you have the androecium and the gynoecium. Androecium will have stamen. Stamen will have anther. Anther will produce the pollen grains and release it. Pollen grains will contain the male gamete. Pollen grain will go and fall on the stigma, which is part of the female reproductive part. The pollen grains containing the male gametes are delivered to the female reproductive part. There it will fuse with the egg cell and form the zygote. This is how the process of sexual reproduction takes place. And that fusion of male gamete and female gamete is called fertilization. Now, after this fertilization takes place, what happens is the ovary will transform into the fruit. The ovules present within the ovary will transform into the seed. Okay? So, fruits are nothing but ovary formed. Ovaries will transform into fruit after fertilization. So, we can say that fruits are fertilized ovaries. But in some cases, fruits are formed even without fertilization. Such fruits are called parthenocarpic fruits, which will be seedless because fertilization has not occurred. Only if fertilization occurs, ovules are transformed into seeds. If fertilization does not occur, such fruits will not have seeds. Such fruits are said to be parthenocarpic. Okay. Now, in fruits which are fertilized, you will find two parts. One is the wall of the fruit, which we call the pericarp. Peri means around. I already told you when I spoke about perigynous. Carp means fruit. So, what is present outside, around in the fruit? It is the fleshy part, edible part usually in fleshy fruits. The fruit wall is called the pericarp. And whatever lies inside the fruit seed, which is nothing but the fertilized ovule, these are the two parts that you will see in a fruit. Inside you will have the seed. Enclosing the seed, you will have the wall of the fruit. Right? Wall of the fruit is called pericarp. In many fruits, the pericarp can be distinguished into three different regions or three different layers. Outermost is called the epicarp. Epi means above. So, carp again is fruit. Outermost layer in the wall of the fruit is epicarp. Meso means middle. Middle layer of the fruit wall is called mesocarp. Endo means inside. Innermost layer in the wall of the fruit is called endocarp. So in some fruits, for example, in coconut and mango, which is the type of fruit called drupe, you can see that such fruits develop from monocarpellary. One carpel, superior ovaries. Superior ovaries means other floral whorls will arise from below it and the flower is hypogynous, right? So such fruits develop from monocarpellary superior ovules. They will have only one seeds. Over here you can see this clearly epicarp, mesocarp, endocarp. Epicarp in coconut is the outer leathery portion of tender coconut. Outer leathery portion, smooth portion in tender coconut, that is the epicarp. Once you remove that, you have a lot of fibrous stuff. That is the mesocarp. If you remove all of this inside, you have a hard part, right? After you remove all of these fibers, you have a hard part. That is stony in nature. That is the endocarp. Mesocarp is fibrous in coconut. Okay, so what we eat, what is edible here is the endosperm. You just learn about it now. In detail, you don't have to know how exactly it is formed and all of that. You learn it in your other chapters. For now, just focus what we eat in a tender coconut is actually the endosperm. Within that, the seed will be present. Coming to mango, outer layer is the epicarp. Some people eat it, some people throw it away. Inside that, you have the mesocarp. This mesocarp is fleshy in nature. If you finish eating the mesocarp, you know there is a hard layer, right? That is the endocarp. Similar to coconut, even in mango, it is stony or hard. If you break that open, within that, you can find the seed present. Okay, so coconut and mango are a type of fruits called drupes. Here in the pericarp or the ovary wall or the fruit wall, you have three distinct layers: outer epicarp, middle mesocarp, inner endocarp. All right. Now let's talk about seeds. Seeds are nothing but fertilized ovules. I already told you about the process of fertilization. Fertilization is nothing but the male gamete fusing with the female gamete. Once this fertilization process is over, the ovules will develop into the seeds. Okay, so seeds are nothing but fertilized ovules. Within seeds, you can find some parts. Outside, you will have the seed coat. Within the seed coat, you will find two very, very important structures. One is the embryo. The other is the endosperm. Embryo is going to become the future plant. So when you sow a seed, it will germinate and become a future plant, right? That part of the seed, that part that is present inside the seed is called the embryo, and endosperm is a nutritive tissue. Now, within a seed, let's say this is one seed, you will have the embryo and the endosperm. This embryo will develop into the future plant. When this embryo when the seed has to germinate, the embryo has to give out those epicotyle, hypocotyle, radical, plumule have to come out. Before the first leaf is produced, the seed will need some energy, right? Because plants get energy from photosynthesis. A seed doesn't already have leaves that can photosynthesize, right? So for the development of this embryo to become the future plant, energy is required, and this endosperm nourishes the developing embryo. It will obtain, embryo as it grows, it will obtain the nourishment from the endosperm. All right. So as the embryo grows, the endosperm content will go on reducing. Now, talking about the types of seeds, depending upon how many cotyledons are present. In a seed, we have two different types of seeds. First type is dicotyledonous seed. Second type is monocotyledonous seed. As the name itself indicates, in dicotyledonous seeds, we have two cotyledons, 1 and 2. In monocotyledonous seeds, we have only one cotyledon. Okay, about this you must have learned in your lower grades as well. Now let's move on to learn about each of these type of seeds, monocot seed and dicot seed. We'll start with the dicot seed. Talking about the seed coat. Seed coat is the outermost covering, obviously. The seed coat will have two layers. The outer layer is called testa. The inner layer is called tegmen. I told you that the ovules will be attached to the ovary. On the ovary, there will be a cushion like placenta, and the ovule is attached to the ovary on the placenta, right? Now, there will be a scar on the seed which indicates the point of attachment. So, if this is a fruit, let's say this is one fruit, and over here the seed is attached. So, this point at which the seed is attached to the fruit, in the seed, you can see that as a mark or as a scar. That is called the hilum. So, hilum is the scar through which the seeds were attached to the fruit. The seeds are attached to the fruit means ovules are attached to the ovary. The point at which the ovules were attached to the ovary, the seeds were attached to the fruit. At that point on the seeds, you can see a scar. We call it the hilum. If you've seen black-eyed peas and some seeds, you can see clearly there is a color differentiation also. The rest of the seeds will be in one color and that part will be in another color. That is nothing but the hilum. It indicates the point at which the seed was attached to the fruit. Okay. Now, there is something called the micropyle. Just above the hilum, you can see a structure called micropyle. Micropyle is basically a small opening. So, it is through this opening that the pollen tube will enter the ovule. Okay, so you learn about it in your other chapters going forward. For now, just remember, just above the hilum, there is a portion or a part called the micropyle, which is a small pore. That's about the seed coat. Now let's talk about the embryo. Embryo is one of the things that is present within the seed coat. The other thing is the endosperm. First we learn about embryo, then we'll move on to endosperm. Okay, so embryo has two parts, cotyledons and embryonal axis. All of you may have seen these seeds, right, that have sprouted. So over here you can see this is the embryo. It has two parts. This is the cotyledon. Since this is a dicot plant, we have two cotyledons, one cotyledon, two cotyledon. And whatever I'm going to highlight now in red, this is the embryonal axis. At the node of the embryonal axis, which is this, you can find that two cotyledons are attached. Okay. So in dicots, the cotyledons are fleshy, very large as you can see, 2 in number, and full of reserve food materials. When you take this embryonal axis, at one end of the embryonal axis you have the plumule, at the other tip of the embryonal axis you have the radicle. The plumule will eventually develop into the shoot system of the plant, whereas the radicle will give rise to the root system of the plant post germination. Okay, So that is about the embryo. There is an axis. At one point on the axis, there are two cotyledons present. The part of the axis above the cotyledon, this part, whatever I'm highlighting in red color right now, this is called the epicotyle. Epi again means above. Part present above this point is epicotyle, and there is a part present below it which is called hypocotyle. Tip of the epicotyle, you have plumule. Tip of the hypocotyle, you have radicle. Plumule will develop into the shoot system. Radicle will develop into the root system. All right. Now let's move on. Second part, within the seed coat, like I said, is the endosperm. Endosperm, like I already mentioned, is nutritive in function. It stores food. It is a product of double fertilization. Double fertilization basically is two male gametes fuse in angiosperms. You've learnt in the chapter Plant Kingdom that in angiosperms, one characteristic feature is double fertilization, right? Syngamy happens where the male gamete fuses with the female gamete to give rise to the zygote. Zygote will eventually become the embryo. Triple fusion will happen where the second male gamete will fuse with two haploid polar nuclei to become a triploid primary endosperm nucleus, which will eventually give rise to the endosperm. So both embryo and endosperm are formed because of double fertilization. So depending upon the presence of endosperm, seeds are of two types: endospermic, non-endospermic, self-explanatory. If at maturity endosperm is present in the seeds, it is called endospermic. If at maturity endosperm is absent in the seeds, it is called non-endospermic. Most dicotyledonous seeds are non-endospermic, example bean, gram pea. Most of very few of the dicotyledons are endospermic, example castor. If you consider dicot seeds, majority of them are non-endospermic, very few of them are endospermic. Bean, pea, gram, all of these are non-endospermic. Castor is endospermic. Okay, so that's about dicotyledonous seeds. Now let's talk about monocotyledonous seeds. Again, this will have the seed coat. In monocot seeds, usually like maize, what happens is the seed coat and the fruit wall would have fused. Seed coat would have fused with the fruit wall. What you're looking at here is an example of maize seed. Okay. So seed coat is the outermost covering. In cereals like maize, it is generally fused with the fruit wall. Within the seed coat, you can find two parts, whichever part I'm going to highlight right now. Over here or outline. This part is known as the endosperm. Okay. And we have another part which I'm highlighting here in blue color. This part is the embryo. Similar to how we saw in dicot plant, even in monocot plant, you will have an embryonal axis. So if you can think of this as an embryonal axis, there is only one cotyledon because this is monocot. This one cotyledon is large and shield shaped. This cotyledon is called the scutellum. The part of the axis above this point is called epicotyle. The part of the axis below it is called hypocotyle. Tip of hypocotyle is called radicle. Tip of epicotyle is called plumule. One characteristic feature of monocot seed is that the radicle and plumule, these regions are covered by sheath-like structures. The sheath that is covering the plumule is called the coleoptile. The sheath that is covering the radicle is called as coleorhiza. Imagine this embryo that you're seeing here is placed here obliquely. This is the axis. This is the axis. This is the shield-shaped cotyledon, single cotyledon. This is called the scutellum. Tip of the epicotyle is called the plumule. Tip of the hypocotyle is called the radicle. Radicle is covered by a sheath called coleorhiza. Plumule is covered by a sheath called coleoptile. So these are the different parts in the embryo. Apart from this, you have the endosperm. In endosperm, the outer layer, this outer layer here, it is rich in proteins and it is called alluron layer. The inner portion of the endosperm is rich in starch and that is called the starchy endosperm. So that is about the embryo and endosperm in monocotyledonous seeds. In the embryo, like I said, it is very small in size. It is situated in a groove at one end of the endosperm. So endosperm, as you can see, occupies more space than the embryo. The single cotyledon is large and shield-shaped, like I told you, and it is referred to as the scutellum. In the embryonal axis, you have the plumule that is enclosed by the coleoptile and the radicle that is enclosed by coleorhiza. That is about the embryo. Talking about endosperm, it is present within the seed coat. It is very bulky, large in size, and obviously its function is to store food. Outer covering of endosperm separates the embryo from a proteinaceous layer. I told you. Outer layer is rich in proteins. It's a proteinaceous layer that we call the alluron layer. This separates the inner portion of the endosperm from the embryo. That's about the endosperm. Similar to how we learnt in dicot seeds, even in monocot seeds, depending upon whether endosperm is present in the mature seed or not, we can classify it into two types. One is endospermic seed. The other one is non-endospermic seed. In dicot plants or dicot seeds, we saw that in majority of them, endosperm is absent at maturity. In monocots, it is the opposite. In majority of monocots, you can see that endosperm is present in the seeds even at maturity. So, example, you have maize. And in some plants, monocots like orchids, endosperm is absent at maturity. So, that is about seeds and its structure and variation, okay, and different types. So with this, we have covered the different types of inflorescence, flower, the different classifications of flower, variations that we see in sepals, petals, and rachim, gynoecium. Then we spoke about fruit, and finally we spoke about seed, its morphology, and different types. So with this, we have covered the second lecture of the chapter Morphology of Flowering Plants. I hope you stayed attentive till the end of the session. I hope you took notes. I urge you all to study and read the NCERT textbook today itself based on whatever else was taught, so that it retains very well in your memory. Okay, so with this, I would like to sign off from today's session. I'll see you soon in the next session.